the title of the presentation is how to understand the failure of the dollar. The dollar is failing. And I want to talk about that and drill in a little bit. And first, I want to make a nod. I want to address the standard argument that we, the gold standard movement, has made and have made over 40 plus years. And for many of the people making this argument, it really is this simple. And unfortunately, that's not so. You ready? The argument is we need the gold standard because inflation. That's it. The Fed, prints money. As the money supply increases, the price level increases, and this is the problem, and that's why we need the gold standard. It really is that simple. End of story. Now, the problem with this argument is that, first of all, it's not true economically. It doesn't actually work like that. Secondly, what we have today is not money but credit. I'm going to be talking a lot more about the nature of the dollar. And thirdly, there's no urgency, right? If that's all it is, that prices are going up at whatever % per year, we should talk about something more important, like deregulating food trucks in New York City, or whether you can post specifications for your guns on the internet. We should be talking about something important, that prices are rising at, if you believe the official CPI at 0%, or others argue it's 5 or 6% or whatever it is. There's no urgency there. We've had prices rising for 100 plus years since the creation of the Fed, and there's no reason why they couldn't continue to rise for another 100 years or another 1,000 years. Who cares? And so I'm going to make the argument and realize this is a strong and potentially controversial stand. This argument is a political loser. So let's rewind back to 1971. President Nixon, and if you haven't seen the video of this, you should. It's on YouTube. Declares that he's going to temporarily end redeemability of the dollar. He's going to protect the purchasing power of your dollar, blah, 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 blah. It's not going to matter. It's all for the good. Subsequent to that, prices really began, they were already quite in a rising trend even before that, really began to go gangbusters. By 1979, I think the official CPI number was 12 or 13%. I'm pretty sure the reality for prices was actually much higher than that. So in 1979, just to take that as the example of the worst of the price rising, two things. One, prices were out of control and people were quite upset about it. And number two, the gold standard was current events. They remembered that as recently as we remember the presidency of George Bush. It wasn't ancient history as it is now, the gold standard being 44 years ago when it ended. At that time, it was current events. And if the argument that we need the gold standard because inflation was not compelling back in 1979, then today, with whatever you want to argue the rate of prices rising, whatever that rate is, it's a lot less compelling today, and the gold standard is not current events today, but it's history. So here's how I would position it. People care about rising prices, but not that much. It's the sort of thing that people go to a bar with their buddies and they sort of bitch and moan, oh yeah, I remember when gas was this, blah, 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 blah. And then the game comes on and they don't care about prices anymore. And on top of it, I would argue, speaking of the game, they care more about whether the football was inflated than whether the dollar is inflated. So I'm gonna dismiss the argument we need the gold standard because inflation for these and many other reasons, and say that you can't understand the failure of the dollar simply in terms of either money supply or prices. You have to look a little bit deeper. So the theme of my talk today is that incentives matter, and that a great deal of what economics studies is it studies incentives. So if something is failing, we need to understand who is incentivized to do what and how that causes a failure. And I'm going to be touching on that, and I'll wrap that theme up by the end. So one other thing I want to say about this so-called inflation, and my definition of inflation, by the way, is not about either rising money supply or rising prices. My definition of inflation is quite different, and I'll cover that later. The one thing I want to talk about is the erroneous notion of looking at this relationship. Money supply increases, prices increase. How is that supposed to work? And I think if proponents of this view could articulate it clearly, and one of the problems with economics generally is a lack of clear articulation. What do we mean by these terms? How is this connected to this? And so forth. They would try to say something like, inflation is caused when the money supply increases faster than the goods supply. I think that would be, and I'm trying to bend over backwards to express in a neutral tone a view with which I disagree. That's always quite challenging, and I may be slightly off. There might be right now a proponent of this view, upset and yelling at me through the screen. No, you got it all wrong. But I think it's something like that. Money supply is rising, supply of goods and services is rising. If money supply is rising faster, then then we're going to have rising prices. I want to point out, first of all, if you look at the markets today, we see the prices of commodities are falling. And so this is actually not true if you look at the data. And historically, there are times when the correlation was very good. There are times like now when the correlation is not very good. But to drill a little bit deeper into this curious relationship, we're comparing a rate of this to a rate of this. I want to point out that we're actually not making a proper comparison. And so when we say money supply, what do we mean? We mean a quantity. In economics terms, we mean a stocks. We mean a number of dollars, or in the gold standard, we mean a number of ounces. But when we say goods supply, what do we mean? Goods are consumed. They're produced at the rate at which they're consumed. They're consumed at the rate at which they're produced. So in the case of a goods supply, we don't mean a quantity such as ounces. We mean a rate such as ounces per year, or in the case of wheat, bushels per year. In the case of crude oil, barrels per year, or per month, or per day, or per hour, or whatever it is. So we're trying to compare a supply of something that is not consumed, which is measured as a stocks, which is measured, let's say, in the gold standard, just to keep this simple. We're comparing ounces of gold extant to production of oil per year, barrels per year. That's a fundamentally invalid comparison. That is like comparing how far am I from my house to the rate at which Tom is driving in his car. You cannot make that comparison. At the very root of it, that is fundamentally invalid, that is fundamentally wrong. And all of the conclusions you're going to get from that are wrong. Many of the critics of the regime of the Federal Reserve in 2009 were predicting hyperinflation by the end of the year. And on what did they base this prediction? The rise of the money supply. The Fed increased the quantity of dollars in the system enormously in 2009. And they said, well, that's it. It's going to hyperinflate. They were wrong, handing, by the way, a lot of easy arguments to our enemies. The Paul Krugmans of the world can point to these wrong predictions and say, see, we were right and the Austrian school is wrong. This approach, this basic view of money supply and goods supply is false at its root. I want to drill down into something that's always bothered me in every field I've come to study. And my background is as an engineer before I became an economist. And that is, before we talk about the quantity of money, we should talk about, okay, we're talking about a quantity of something. Let's talk about the something. What exactly is it? And so I want to start off with a relatively simple example. Suppose I live next door to Tom, and it's in the winter, it's snowing like mad, and I want to bake a cake. So I literally go across the lawn, I knock on his kitchen window, and I say, can I please borrow a pound of sugar? I'll pay you back. He says, okay. So he literally takes out a kitchen napkin, and we write up on the kitchen napkin a little deal that says, Keith, borrow from Tom 1 pound of sugar. And then I sign it, and he keeps it in his kitchen as evidence of a debt that I owe him sugar. Next week, the roads are clear. I go to the store, I buy an extra sack of sugar. I go back to his kitchen window, I knock again. I hand him the sugar. We take the napkin, tear it up, and throw it out. The debt existence. That is really, really, really key when, and it's similar to gold in this respect. When we use a commodity and borrow, and then repay in that commodity, the debt itself goes out of existence. Now, the dollar, well, the dollar is not a commodity. It's actually credit. And if you take a look at a dollar bill, by the way, bill is an old word, perhaps arguably an archaic word, meaning a bill of credit. On the dollar bill, it says Federal Reserve Note. Note is also a word evidencing credit, as in promissory note. So it's the credit of the Federal Reserve. The Fed owes you $1. So suppose you go to a restaurant and enjoy a great meal with some wine. At the end of the evening, for you and your loved one, you owe $100 to the restaurant. So you take out a $100 bill, you put it down on the table, you are free to go, the police are not going to arrest you, you're not stealing, you're out of the debt loop. But notice the debt does not go out of existence. In economics terms, we use the term extinguish. The debt is not extinguished. The debt is still there. It's merely been shifted. Now the Federal Reserve owes the restaurant the money instead of you owing the restaurant the money. What is the restaurant going to do the next morning? Well, the restaurant is going to deposit that $100 bill in a bank. And what does that mean? Well, now that means the bank owes the restaurant the money and the Fed owes the bank the money. Well, what is the bank going to do with it? Well, by business model and by regulation, the bank is going to buy a treasury bond. And so now the treasury owes the bank the money, the bank owes the restaurant. And you see what we have is this thing is just shifted around. Think of it as a lump under the rug, and we can keep shifting, pushing the lump here and there. We can't actually make the lump go away. A debt cannot be extinguished using a debt, using an IOU, using a credit as the means of payment. So we pay a debt using dollars, but the dollar is itself a debt, so all that does is shift it. Debt cannot be repaid in the system anywhere, anyhow, no way, no how. To use a term that many engineers and computer software people will recognize, this is not a bug, it's a feature. And this is the regime that Nixon plunged us into in 1971 when he ended the money. There is no way to repay any debt in the system ever, anywhere. Now, the next piece of this, and this begins to shed some light on the nature of the problem, is that all of that debt is borrowed by somebody somewhere. But let's say you owe $100,000, and let's say the interest rate is 10%, lower than that, but let's say it's 10% to keep the math easy. Then interest accrues at a rate of 10% per year. So at the end of the year, you don't owe $100,000 anymore, you owe $110,000. The interest is added to the debt, and the interest is either. It cannot be paid off in final or extinguished. And so that gives us a picture, and if you take a look at debt at any level, but just use the federal government, since 1971, we have seen the rate at which the debt is rising. It's a very, very scary curve. It's an exponential curve. Now, any scientist who studies animal populations, any engineer who studies electrical engineering, such as amplifiers, epidemiologists who study disease vectors, anytime you have a situation, or for that matter, physicists who study thermonuclear explosions, anytime you have an exponential rate of growth of something, the system grows at that rate until it utterly fails to be able to grow at that rate, and then it collapses. If you see a guitarist in a rock band hold his guitar up to the amplifier, and he gets that feedback, if there wasn't a circuit in there that clipped it and prevented it from continuing to rise, then the only way that would end would be something would catch on fire. The circuit would be getting hotter and hotter and hotter until it would literally catch on fire and fail. And that's how exponential systems are. Our monetary system, this is not a prediction as to who might be elected in the next election. This has nothing to do with whether Congress is going to get it, whether there'll be discipline, the Republicans versus the Democrats, Ron Paul versus the Republicans, whoever your favorite candidate may be. This is a mathematical prediction based on the design, the very nature, the very mechanics, the very root of the monetary system. It is designed, the debt necessarily must grow exponentially and has been growing exponentially since Nixon did this to us in 1971. Actually, if you look at it, after 1971, the rate of debt, or the total debt, excuse me, was growing, doubling about every 8 years. Recently, it seems to be more like every 7 or slightly less. And so not only is it growing exponentially, I think the exponent is also rising. So this is now the first case to be made that this system must necessarily have a final terminus, an end. It's not like prices that can keep rising forever. It's that debt is rising, and debt cannot rise forever, just as a population cannot rise forever, whether it be deer in the forest or whether it be a virus, expanding, like Ebola, expanding through the human population, cannot continue that way, and what cannot continue will not. So that's a huge problem in the system. A lot of economists of what I'll call the mainstream persuasion, and I'll pick on Paul Krugman as a typical example of this, will respond to, the Tea Party argument is look at the debt and look how terrible this is, and they'll say debt to GDP is this ratio, and try to make an argument from that. And Paul Krugman is going to put on this oily smile and say, no, look, you don't understand, that's the wrong graph to be looking at. It's not about debt to GDP. It's about, and I'm going to coin the term that he doesn't use just to make it clearer, it's about VIG to GDP. VIG is short for vigorish, and for people that got involved in borrowing from loan sharks, the VIG is the amount you got to pay Rocco every week in order to keep your kneecaps intact. It's the mandatory fee that you have to pay in order to service the debt. And so in a world where debt can never be paid off, then the key is servicing it. And so what Paul Krugman is saying is that the cost of servicing the debt as a proportion of GDP is low, and in some cases maybe even lower than it ever has been. I'm going to get back to, of course, the obvious reason why this is so is because the interest rate is falling. So the cost of servicing the debt is as a function of the interest rate. If you cut the interest rate in half, then the same amount of debt costs half to service. I'm going to talk a lot about falling interest rate in a moment, but what I want to say about debt is that there's another way of looking at debt, and I agree with Krugman. It's wrong to try to draw conclusions of debt to GDP. I don't think that number in itself is terribly meaningful. Instead, I would point people to a concept called the marginal productivity of debt. And what that simply means is for every new dollar that we borrow, how much does that add to GDP? So if we add $1 to our debt and that adds $10 to GDP, then you can say, hey, you know what? GDP is growing way ahead of debt. We're not worried about it. On the other hand, if you borrow $1 and you get 6 cents of GDP, then you might be concerned. And so in one of my articles on Forbes, I put together a graph looking at the marginal productivity of debt since around 1950, and that's because that was the earliest data in a series that I was able to get without digging too much deeper. Since 1950, marginal productivity of debt, how much new GDP you add for each dollar of debt that you add, has been in decline. So that's a trend that looks like this, and my finger being near the bottom here, let's assume that's 0. What happens when you cross below 0? What happens when you cross below 0 is that now you have to borrow and you're actually reducing GDP, which by the way happened in 2008 and I think first quarter of 2009, if I'm not mistaken. And it may be happening again right now. Q1, according to the initial estimate of GDP, declined. So this is a dangerous trend. It's a multi-decade trend. This way predates Obama, by the way. That it's falling, and it's not easy to fix the drivers of this trend. And when it goes below 0, that's another sign that this is the end. You're borrowing money to destroy GDP. How long can you sustain that, and how will you do that? You make it up in volume? I mean, what? So that's That, I think, is the better way of looking at debt, and that's the answer to Paul Krugman when he says the interest on the debt has never been lower as a proportion of GDP. Is to say, yeah, but the amount of new debt GDP we get from that borrowed dollar of debt has never been lower either. And of course, he's not going to have an answer to that because that's the simple fact of the matter. So let's talk a little bit now about falling interest rates, because that's the key to Krugman's magic. And actually, it's the key to a lot of other magic as well. It's also the key, one of the reasons why people don't care about the inflation argument. The people who own assets are going to say, Keith, you're right. My cost of living is going up 4, 5, 6% a year, whatever it is, but my portfolio is going up at 40% a year. I'm not actually unhappy about this state of affairs. I'm getting richer. And yeah, you're probably right. It's probably terribly unfair. I realize that this is unearned wealth that's coming to me, but just hold on. Let this go another 5 or 10 years. I'm going to be a made man. And, maybe fix the inflation. But right now it's working for me. So the problem with a falling interest rate is that by definition and by nature, that translates into a rising price on assets in general. That's real estate, that's stocks, and obviously bonds. One cautionary thing that I want to say here at some point: never let an economist, and this includes me, make an assertion, a macroeconomic assertion that, this tends to be this. The money supply tends to cause prices to rise or whatever it is, without understanding the mechanics. How does this cause this, and by what a set of steps? Why is this inexorably so? If you have the discipline to do that, I think you'll avoid more than 90% of the errors in economics. So I just made a statement. I just said falling interest is equivalent to rising asset prices. What do I mean by that, and how does that work? Well, let's start with bonds, which are one of the largest classes of assets, a much larger class, by the way, than stocks. I don't know how that compares to real estate. It may or may not be, probably larger than real estate as well. When the interest rate falls, there is a rigid, or any change in the interest rate, there is a rigid mathematical inverse. It is a teeter-totter, that a falling interest rate is a rising bond price. And the explanation of that is a little bit outside the scope of this discussion. But suffice to say, if you buy a bond when interest rates are 10%, if the bond is a perpetuity, if the bond goes forever, which we don't have in the United States, but they do have in England, they do have some perpetuities, then every halving of the interest rate on a perpetuity is a doubling of the bond price. That's just simply the mechanics of how the bond market works. That, by the way, is not a controversial statement. On a 30-year bond, it's not quite a doubling. I want to say it's about 80%-ish. On a 10-year bond, it's a little bit less. But every bond goes up as the interest rate goes down. And so as the Fed pushes down the rate of interest, and let's be realistic here. The Fed claims as its purpose what? The official mandate is to maintain employment, or what they call full employment, and to maintain what they call price stability, both of which are disingenuous, because full employment means 5% of every able-bodied adult looking for work is out of work, and stable prices means prices are relentlessly rising at 2%. But those are the Fed's twin mandates, and I say nonsense. The actual purpose of the Fed is to enable the government to borrow more at cheaper rates than it otherwise could, because why? Because politicians get elected by making promises of doling out free bennies. And people don't like taxes, so borrowing is the magic solution. Borrowing is the holy grail. It's the perpetual motion machine of economics. If you borrow, then you don't have to tax it. Nobody's really upset about it, and you have an entire field of monetary economics to justify why this is not only not a problem, why this is actually good. So the Fed pushes down the rate of interest. That is its job. That is its function. That is what it is supposed to do. That is, again, not a bug, but a feature. And the bond prep is a direct, linear consequence of that. Now, What happens if you're a bond owner and you're happy to sit there and clip coupons when the interest rate is 10% and they push down the rate of interest, right? So they push it down, they push it down, they push it down, they push it down. At some point, each individual person has their walking away point. You know, it goes from 10% to 9 to 8 to 7 to 6. And meanwhile, this is a profit. This is a capital gain. But in addition, it's a reduction in the yield on this thing that you presumably own for its yield. So as they continue to push it down, it's becoming not only more profitable to sell it, but less attractive to hold it. At some point, each individual person and each individual investor has a walking away point where he says, I'm selling that bond. So you sell the bond, and now you immediately confront the dilemma of what are you going to do with the proceeds? Well, you're not going to, I mean, if you have a profit, you'll consume some of that as, as income, and you'll, enjoy and buy a nice car and take vacations and do all that stuff. But this is your capital. This is your life savings. You're not interested in spending it just because you don't like the bond market anymore. Logically, there are two other asset classes that people turn to: stocks and real estate. So the pushing up of the bond price tends to bleed over by this process of each individual person expressing a preference and saying, I don't like bonds anymore. I'm going to sell my bond and buy stocks. I'm going to sell my bond and buy real estate. And so by relentlessly pushing up the bond price, the Fed is relentlessly pushing people out of the bond market and into other markets where they feel they can get a better return or a better yield. And therefore, the relentless rise in bond prices bleeds over and becomes a relentless rise in stock market prices. That is the mechanics of how that works. Is people prefer to own this rather than that, and so then these prices come back up and continue to go up until there's an even choice between this and this. Bonds will always lead because the risk on a government bond is lower than the risk on Netflix stocks, and arguably that might be lower than the risk of whatever piece of real estate you might be looking at. Real estate can sit empty, real estate can turn into a bad area. There's 100 things that can happen to real estate that would destroy the value of the investment. And so bonds have to be pushed even farther into territory where they become unattractive in order to push people out into these crazy high risk things. But if the Fed is relentless in doing it, then that process occurs relentlessly. So this is a pernicious process. This is a process that I would call perverse. There's a common saying that people use the term unintended consequences. And I don't like that expression because I think that grants a premise that should not be conceded, which is that the intentions were honest and yet somehow it just worked out badly for some inexplicable reason. I prefer to look at it this way, that there are perverse incentives, and if you impose a perverse incentive on people, then you get a perverse outcome because people take perverse actions. And so in the case of this relentlessly rising market for assets, well, how do people deal with this, right? So everybody's aware, and I want to make the case we're destroying capital. That's where I'm going with this, to be open and clear about it. Everybody's aware when you have a bubble in the stock market and then the bubble bursts, there's some guy who bought at a stock price collapses down to 10, right? That's almost approximately back in 2000, 2002, I think $80 or something like that. And then Amazon was below $10 at one point in 2002. Everybody understands that's a gigantic loss of money to the greater fool who bought, at the very top. He was the last guy to buy at the highest possible price. I'm making an argument that's actually deeper than that, and that is on the way up. Even if the Fed could somehow engineer asset bubbles that expand forever and could somehow never allow prices to come down, the process of capital destruction is relentlessly increasing as the prices are rising. And so I'm going to make a statement and then hopefully prove it to everybody's satisfaction. The statement is that a rising set of prices, a bubble, is a machine for converting, and I use the word conversion in the legal sense. In the legal sense, there's overtones of an illicit taking of somebody else's property for a benefit that benefits you, and that person doesn't benefit or disapproves or whatever. A rising asset bubble is a machine for the conversion of one person's wealth into another person's income. Now think about the perversity of that. So we'll get back to the perversity. First, let's talk about the mechanics of that. So you have this stock market, and it could be Netflix shares, it could be whatever, biotechnology shares. The Chinese Shanghai index right now, I think, is up 300 or 400% in 9 months. I mean, it's insane. What's happening is each person is buying into that asset simply on the hopes of selling it. Speculation. It's not investment. Investment is something you buy with a rational expectation of a yield. A speculation is you buy something with the hope of selling it to somebody else at a higher price. And there can be rational speculations and otherwise. That's not really my point here. My point is you're buying this stock or you're buying this ETF or whatever, a mutual fund, with the hope of selling it to somebody else at a higher price. So let's suppose that works. We're talking about a scenario in which the Fed can engineer the stock market to levitate indefinitely forever. So let's say I come along and I buy shares of something at 100, and then those shares go up to, I have some limit where I decide I'm out, 175, and then Tom buys it off of me at 175. And obviously he's doing it because he expects it to go to 350 or whatever. He may be right, he may be wrong, it doesn't matter. The point is, he just forked over to me 175, let's say $175,000, assuming we're throwing around a lot of 1,000 shares. He just forked over to me $175,000. Now, the curious thing about this is nobody will spend their life savings. That's the biblical story of the prodigal son. Everybody that has a work ethic, everybody that has any regard for the future, and anybody who's rational says, okay, I worked hard to save up all this money. I'm not interested in spending my life savings, but I'm perfectly happy to spend some of my income. So to me, the $100,000 at it is my life savings. It just went up to 175. So I have $75,000 of income. The 100 I'm going to put back into another investment, of course, and I may even take a big part of the profit or the gains that I made, and put that into, add to my savings. I want my savings to grow. So let's say I take 25,000 and I put that into, add to my investment capital. That leaves me $50,000. That is income to me, and I can spend my income. I earned it. It's legitimate. Every dollar spends the same as every other dollar. That $50,000 is the equivalent to what an experienced professional plumber might have earned for an entire year, and I made it flipping one stock maybe in a few months or whatever it is. So I go out and buy myself, I go and buy myself a sports car, 50 grand. I've got myself a sports car now. Now, the problem with this, let's look at this now, again, mechanically, what's happening in the economy. Normally, in order to earn the right to consume something, you first have to produce. And there's a couple of ways you can produce. You can either generate the ideas that when they're put into practice, produce wealth. You could be the CEO, you could be the inventor. You could be the investor. You put capital at risk, and you're going to make a profit when that capital turns into something that produces a product that consumers want to buy. Or you can work. But you're either taking risk, or you're contributing ideas, or you're contributing labor. Those are the three ways that in a free market that you earn the right to consume something. You first have to produce it, and those are the three ways of producing. In this case, you haven't done any of those things. You could argue, yeah, I put capital at risk, but your capital didn't finance any productive activity. It was a pure bet in the casino, pure speculation. And the background to this, as we said, was the Fed has engineering a rise in prices. The Fed is engineering a bubble that somehow never bursts. So this is not the case of an investor taking a risk and financing a factory that's going to produce a cure for cancer and then becoming rich, and rightfully so. This is the case of the Fed creating a casino, taking the risk out of the casino and telling everybody unlimited free money. So I go and buy my sports car. That sports car is real consumption, right? I mean, people have to get paid wages to produce it. Those people then take those wages and spend it on food and housing and heating oil and all of those other things. The factory itself has tooling. Every time you stamp out a part in a factory, that tooling undergoes a certain amount of wear and tear, and that only has a finite cycle, and then the capital has to be replaced. All of these things are consuming real resources that have to somehow be replaced. And I'm getting the right to consume those resources without having produced or contributed to the production of any resources myself. Is this sustainable? Consumption without production? Or is there not an iron law that says before one can consume, one must produce first? And if you don't produce, you can't. Well, the only exception to that is I can consume if I don't produce by consuming what somebody else has produced. So back to my definition of this speculation, what I'm consuming is a portion of Tom's life savings. Tom forked over $175,000 to me. I'm consuming his capital. That the Fed has created a perverse environment in which he is willing, and not only willing to, he's happy to fork over his life savings, or a big chunk of it. If he had to work as a plumber, let's say, how many years would it take after paying all your living expenses, after enjoying life a little bit, taking a vacation now and then, how many years would it be to accumulate $175,000 in savings? 10, 20 years, maybe more. He's taking all of that surplus labor of his own, which he has now in the form of savings, all those years that he spent a little bit less than he produced in order to save that up. He's handing it over to me, and I'm taking a big chunk of it, a little bit less than a third of it, and turning it into a sports car. So I'm literally consuming a little bit less than a third of Tom's life savings as a plumber in order to drive around in my Zeppy new red sports car. That is what this Fed engineered asset bubble situation does. That's where the rubber hits the road. That's what falling interest rates means. And so I think I've just got a few minutes left, and I want to tie a couple of things together. At the very beginning of this talk, I referenced this idea of incentives, and I want to tie that now into destruction. So suppose the government passes a law that is going to be destructive to your interests. There's a fascinating example. Many of you may have heard about the horrible conditions in the tenement buildings in London in the late 17th and early 18th century. And they didn't even have windows for these people. And it was just, humid and hot, and people were cooking in there. It was just polluted and smelly and so forth. The government had passed a law that imposed a tax on the building owners based on the number of windows. So unsurprisingly, people boarded up all the windows and said, we don't have any windows here, we're not paying any tax. Whatever the government might do, that's going to impose something destructive on you. If the government says to you as a farmer, you're not allowed to have more than X amount of land planted under crop at any given moment, then farmers will sneak it. They'll find a hidden valley, or they'll put up a wall, and behind the wall there's a small little garden or whatever it is. People will do something to get around the law. If there's a tax that says we tax income, then those who have the sophistication and hire the attorneys will shift. It's not income anymore. It's now offshore income. It's now sheltered income. It's now capital gains. Whatever categories government is going to go after you, people will find a way of escaping out of that category by getting out of it. And so that's actually a good thing. I mean, dictators like Hugo Chavez and his successor Maduro hate it because people don't, willingly walk into the fire for the dictator. But it's actually good because this is how people preserve their lives and livelihoods and life savings, and ultimately the capital on which our civilization depends. But now look at the perversity of this Fed-engineered game of falling interest rates and rising asset prices. Instead of the government attacking you overtly with something that is trying to destroy your life savings or trying to destroy your capital, the government instead offers a perverse incentive that says, well, if you want to participate in the casino, you're going to make money. So instead of people resisting it unwillingly, being dragged kicking and screaming and looking for every possible loophole to avoid it, people are rushing into it because it seems like great fun. Who doesn't want to be in the stock market when prices are rising at 20% a year? Who doesn't want to participate in the bond market with leverage, I might add? So you take a $10,000 investment, lever it up, or $10,000 seed stake, let's say, lever it up with leverage 10 to 1, bet $100,000 on rising bond prices for 34 years and counting, with corrections as we're in now, but for 34 years, there's been relentlessly rising bond prices. Who doesn't want to participate in the market, whichever market that may be, where the profits are? Everybody wants to be there. And unless you're very philosophical and you take that step back and say, what's actually going on here? This seems perfectly legitimate. This seems to make sense. You know, you buy something, it goes up, you sell it, you've made a profit. And meanwhile, what you're actually wreaking is economic destruction, not only on a grand scale, but economy-wide. The Fed has literally come up with a way. Their actual perpetual, what they think is a perpetual motion machine, an actual point of fact, is a machine to convince people to eat their seed corn, to burn their priceless 17th century furniture for firewood, to throw a feast and consume the entire larder for the entire year's worth of saved up food, to party like there's no tomorrow, because people feel they're getting richer. If people realized that as they spent, they were getting poorer, then people would stop spending. That is the perversity of this. That is why the system is failing. Any monetary system that turns from its purpose of enabling production and trade and savings to one that first and foremost incentivizes destruction and consumption of capital is a failing system. And to see it, you can't look at quantity of money. You can't look at rising prices. You have to look at the perverse incentive that the system is offering and the perverse behaviors that are motivated by those perverse incentives and the perverse outcomes that come as a result of those perverse behaviors. That is what our system is doing today. That is the first part of my case for why the dollar is failing, why the entire monetary system is failing. If there's audience interest, I'd love to continue this as a series. There's a heck of a lot more to say than just this. I think every one of these points is understandable by the layman, but there's a lot to say. It isn't really just so simple as the proponents of this inflation theory. They print money, prices go up, it's that simple. There's a lot to say about it, and I'm going to continue to talk as long as people are interested. At this point, I will conclude the lecture part and open it up to Q&A if Tom can handle the video switching. Let's see. Okay, I see some folks on the screen.
Yeah. So,
I can't hear anything. I don't know if anybody's talking or not. And then there's also people that are tuning in through the Google Hangout, which is live. And so, Tom, how do those people submit questions or let you know that they want to talk if they have microphones or whatever?
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, so they would have to either join the Hangout or post a question in the group chat. I don't think they can do that if they're watching the stream on YouTube.
No, probably not. They'd have to join, right?
Okay, once I defeated the switcher, it doesn't seem to want to go back, so I guess you'll just get our audio.
Well, I can see your
Right.
living room. I can
You
see
can
4
see
people
us,
there.
but not our camera feed isn't going into the broadcast.
Oh, I see.
I think I can manually switch it.
Okay, now it is.
Yeah. So I'm actually not in the frame. So
Yes,
there
you're
we
totally.
go. So I actually have a question. What should like the average American layperson do to help protect himself and also, you know, try and do whatever they can to stop this capital destruction on their part? How do they? Well, what should we do?
So, good question. First thing, actually, and I forgot to mention, the Gold Standard Institute, which I founded, is a 501c3 nonprofit. Please, I hope everybody will donate generously. We have a lot of ambitious projects. We want to put out animated whiteboard videos. We want to put on conferences. There's a lot of things that we need to do to educate folks. Please go to goldstandardinstitute.org, and then there's a tab you can click on for donate. I hope everybody will consider doing that. That's the first thing. The second thing is people should become educated up to we drug regulation in New York City. To really underscore the point, this is the most urgent urgentation that we face today. And the best thing you can absolutely do is become educated about it and ask those deeper questions. Why? Understand mechanics. I've put out a lot of material in my Forbes column, which has now moved to the Swiss National Bank and Swiss franc blog. And just study and learn about this. Number 3, encourage friends and colleagues where they show interest. I mean, you can't hang out with your buddies at the bar and then try to force them to be interested in the failing dollar and the gold standard. But where people are interested, talk and be active about it. As far as protecting yourself financially, I can't really give investment advice. That said, I have made no secret that I think the dollar is failing. That is, it will go to zero at some point, not necessarily tomorrow and not necessarily next year. And everybody should ask themselves the questions: just how much exposure to the dollar do I want? Just how much do I really want to be the creditor to Uncle Sam? And that's what it means. If you own dollars, that means you're a lender to Uncle Sam. And what other alternative assets might you want to own in preference to that? That's I think is probably as far as I can go in a public forum.
Okay. Did anyone else here have any questions? Yeah, come on up.
Thanks, Keith. I thought your presentation was great, and I learned a few things. My name is Alfred, by the way. I'm a little bit confused when you say that the dollar is failing. Can you give me a little bit more concrete explanation about, I guess, in what way would I know as a non-economist, how is it failing, and what sort of signs would I expect to see if it is failing more as time goes on? Thank you.
All right, thanks for your question, Alfred, and it's a good question. I think the theme of my talk today is that it's failing because it is incentivizing wholesale consumption of capital, and that's doing the exact opposite of what a proper money, could do and should do and historically has done. Another sign of its failure is the collapse in the rate of interest. Right, so the interest rate has been falling since 1981, and in the rest of the world is more advanced than the United States in this regard. They have negative interest rates in certain places. Now, in the last couple of months, everybody's had a blip, and so they've all gone positive. Or many of them have gone positive again. But when I wrote an article about the failure of the Swiss franc, the Swiss government bond, every government bond with a maturity out to 15 years had a negative interest rate. That means you pay money to the Swiss government, you lend the money to the government, and you get back 15 years later you get back less than you lent. I think that's in itself, prima facie evidence for failure. Another sign of failure of federal government debt or total credit market debt, and you just see this curve, and it's just rising like this. And you ask yourself, well, how long can that go? I mean, nobody knows the exact limit. It's like inflating a balloon. You don't know exactly when it's going to burst, and sometimes, depending on how good the rubber in the balloon is, the thing can go twice as long as, let's say at a party, everybody's taking bets as to where it's going to be. Sometimes it may go a lot longer than that. But clearly, if you keep adding air to the balloon, it has to go. There are a lot of things I didn't cover today, and one of which is the liquidation of labor. So this is one of those very frustrating issues for me, where both the left and the right are wrong for different reasons. The left says, and they're correct, real wages have been falling for decades. The left is absolutely correct in their observation. And they're absolutely wrong in their diagnosis. Their diagnosis is because greed, which is wrong, because employers were just as greedy 40 years ago as they are today. And they're monstrously evil in their prescription, which is we should impose laws to force employers to pay more. And we should have a 90% wealth tax and all these other things that the left is for. The right comes along, and they're eager to oppose the left's conclusion. The left says we should have a 90% wealth tax and a $15 minimum wage. The right is eager to oppose that. So they start by trying to oppose the observation. The right says, no, wages aren't falling. Poor people have never had it better in their lives. And so the right is in denial of the fundamental observation. And so there's no conversation. The two sides aren't talking to each other. And my observation is this. Every business faces a trade-off, constant trade-off of do you want to buy another machine? Do you want to basically invest in a capital asset? Or do you want to hire labor? And there's a balance between the two, right? So the more that the Fed pushes down the rate of interest, the more attractive it is to buy capital assets, because the major cost in the monthly payment of the capital asset is the interest rate. So the Fed is, in this balance of labor versus capital, Fed is making capital cheaper relative, and of course labor is making itself more expensive by pushing up the minimum wage. And so you're getting this ridiculous skewed thing. And so we have wholesale liquidation of labor. So there's the part of the unemployment rate that the government acknowledges in the official unemployment rate, which is a little over 5%, if I remember seeing the last update on that. And then there's the portion of the unemployment rate that is unacknowledged, and it's a giant travesty, and that is people that are not counted in the workforce. This is nothing more than gerrymandering of the district, as it were, of workforce people versus non-workforce people. And there's something like tens of millions, 100 million people, something like that, not counted in the workforce, that are between the ages of 18 and 64, that are not counted. And so we have a failing system. If for some reason there's a group of people over here that want to work, they want to add value, they want to produce something, there are certainly, everybody over here would love to be able to have more goods and services. Who feels they have too much and they want to sacrifice and give up something, right? Everybody always wants more. That's a constant. And somehow these two parties are prevented from being able to come to a mutually agreeable arrangement. That is an economic failure. Now, part of it's regulation and permitting and taxes and all kinds of other stuff, lawsuits, labor law, minimum wage. But a big part of it is monetary. And so we have exponentially rising debt. We have rising asset bubbles and capital consumption. We have wholesale liquidation of labor, and a whole bunch of other topics that I don't want to open up any more, any more curtains than I can address here. Does that answer your question, Alfred?
Somewhat, yeah. I think that it's still a little bit hard to see concretely, because in a real obvious sense, the dollar quote unquote works because I can still, well, assuming I have a dollar, I can still go to the store and I can still buy something. So, I mean, in that sense, it works. But I like your explanation about the effects on labor and the debt going up. But it might still be a little bit too abstract for some people. But yes, thank you.
No, it's a really tough, problem. There's a lot of people writing, about gold and about the dollar who talk about the money illusion, or they talk about the worthless paper dollar. I wrote an article called "The Gold Standard for Libertarians," in which I said, look, this is different from all my other articles. You guys are already on board the idea of gold and sort of against the dollar. However, I'm going to have a very different message for you guys, and that message is stop saying the dollar is worthless. When you say that, 99.9% of the population sees that tinfoil hat on your head because they know that if they have a $50 bill in their pocket, they can go to the grocery store and buy groceries, they can buy gas with it, they can eat out, they can make their car payment, whatever. The dollar is not worthless yet. It will be eventually, but that is not something that we, the advocates of the gold standard, can just assume, just toss out, glibly roll off our tongue the worthless fiat paper dollar. But that's not something we can assume. It's something we have to prove. We have to say, my thesis is the dollar is going to be worthless, and here's why. And so I guess I'll spend a couple of minutes, and I referenced earlier, my definition of inflation is not an increase in the money supply, and is not an increase in prices. My definition of inflation is counterfeiting. It's the counterfeiting of credit. It's monetary fraud. And why do I mean this? So let's take the root of a credit transaction. Somebody borrows money from somebody else, generally for productive purpose. And especially if you go back historically, there wasn't consumer credit. And people would borrow to set up a business of some sort. An entrepreneur sees an opportunity that people would love to buy some of these imported French wines or imported Greek olives or whatever it is. It takes a certain amount of money to commission a ship or whatever to import it. So they borrow money to engage in this venture. In the case of a legitimate credit transaction, there are 4 criteria. The first one is the lender is knowing. He is willingly, he knows that he's giving up his money. And 2, he's willing. He says, yes, I trust you, Keith. Here's my whatever 10 ounces of gold. The other 2 criteria are the borrower, has the means to repay. That is, he's got or is building a productive business whose increased in profits as a result of this credit transaction. But he's borrowing money to increase the amount of money he makes. That increased amount of profit is enough to pay the interest and the principal on the loan. And finally, he has the intent. He's not some sort of crook who's taking the money to abscond with it or whatever. So we have knowing and willing, we have means and intent. Those are the 4 criteria for legitimate credit transaction. Now, what happens today? Well, first of all, the government is the big borrower. They're the elephant in the room. Do they have means and intent? Well, what are they borrowing for? They're borrowing for consumption. It pays salaries, it pays for welfare, it pays for all kinds of crazy programs and bridges to nowhere and so forth. Very little, a negligible amount of what the government spends on is going to produce or add to any income that could actually amortize this. So right there, we have 2 of the 4 criteria for legitimate debt are not met by government borrowing. And now on the creditor side, we're actually missing both of these. I know lots and lots of people who are totally rabidly against, I shouldn't say rabid because I guess they're right. They're totally against lending to the government and owning government bonds, but who work for dollars, have dollars in a bank account, measure their wealth in dollars and so forth. These people represent holders of dollars and demand for dollars, and yet they don't think they're creditors of the government. Actually, they are. That's the magic of the Fed. By transmogrifying, the Fed buys a government bond and issues dollars. By transmogrifying the bond into dollars, people think they're holding money, when in fact, it's nothing more, the dollar is nothing more than a thin slice of the government's debt. So the essential characteristic of our monetary system today is that of counterfeiting. It is borrowing without means or intent to repay from people who are neither knowing nor willing to lend. And what is the necessarily inevitable consequence to counterfeit borrowing? And that is default, right? It cannot be and certainly will not be repaid. And so if the defining characteristic of your monetary system is the racking up, is the accumulation, exponentially rising, by the way, as we said earlier, accumulation of debt that can never be repaid, what happens when one day it finally defaults? Well, Greece is now beginning to see they're getting close to their endpoint. I mean, the U.S. is years off, and maybe longer than that. Greece is getting close. What happens when you can't actually pay at the end of the day? That is failure.
Yeah, Keith, are there any historical parallels in other civilizations that may have failed for the same reasons? Like ancient Rome or the Weimar Republic, or are there any parallels there that we can maybe point to and say something similar happened there? It's, the same thing's happening here. We should really pay attention to that.
Yeah, and a good question. Obviously, in historical examples, there are always differences, and yet, there is a commonality, and that is, monetary debasement, monetary failure. And by the way, with the failure of the currency, because of the perverse incentives, it is driving the failure of productive capital generally. And I think you see the same thing in Rome, and for a variety of reasons that don't necessarily apply today, the way their military worked, and so forth. But you see a disincentive to work in the productive sector. You see a very strong disincentive to own productive capital. Who in the heck wants to own a farm or anything else that's a giant chunk of capital earning next to nothing in the way of yield on it? In an environment where the real profits are to be made in the financial sector. So you have a disincentive for production, an incentive for living off the production of others. You're consuming capital. That's how you get away with it for a while, is you're consuming capital, and that serves in lieu of consuming freshly produced things. Eventually you get to the end. And in Weimar, obviously there were some significant differences. A gigantic debt from a war that Germany had started a few years prior, obviously figures in. I mean, I don't think you can assess that without that. Today, the U.S. doesn't have that circumstance. Rome had some significant differences. And I'm not enough of a historian of Rome to know if it was a debt, if there was a significant debt in the system. I haven't studied it to know that. I do know that they were debasing their coins. Money in those days was gold and silver coins, and with each new issue of coins, there was less and less precious metal and more base metal. But they expected merchants to accept those coins at the same face value, and in fact, at one point, had imposed the death penalty on any merchant who increased his prices. And so now, if you're forced to sell, it's like Venezuela today. If you're forced to sell something that costs you 110, and the law forces you to sell it for 100. You can't continue that, and you're going to do one of two things. You're going to risk your life by charging 110, or I think they also made it illegal to stop, close your store. If you just say, okay, fine, we're out of business and close up shop, I think that was illegal too. But obviously, you can't continue to run at a loss. So I think there's significant similarities, which is we're destroying the productive base. And for me, I think the best analogy to understand what's coming when it finally hits is not 1929. It's not, and so one of the differences with Weimar Germany is the rest of the world still had capital. So collapse, and the same thing when Argentina has had their various collapses, or Zimbabwe. It hasn't been the end of the world because there was the United States and England and other countries that could step in afterwards and serve as a source of capital by buying certain assets lending to get production started again and so forth. 476, excuse me, when Rome collapsed, I think is a better analogy or better model, because there was nobody else there that had the capital. When Rome finally consumed itself from within, it just utterly collapsed. And the population of Rome, 100 years before that, was something over 1 million population in the city of Rome. I believe, a century later, the population was something like 6,000 or 8,000, sheep herders. So it was just a total collapse of everything. And I think, if we don't change course, that's what's coming here.
Okay, I think we have one more question.
All right.
Thank you very much. Very informative and very well put together. So
I can't hear. Tom, can you make sure she's got the mic?
do I need to just stand closer to the mic?
That helps.
Okay. So I started by saying thank you very much. Good presentation that flowed well together, so I, being a non-economist, could really follow it. I have a request and an observation and a question. So the request is, yes, follow-up lectures. I'm especially interested in what you're calling liquidation of labor in future lectures. I'd like to hear more about that.
All right.
My observation is that, respectfully disagreeing with you, a bar might be a great place to try to share economic ideas. I find that adult beverages alone, much less many activities that go on in and around bars, lend themselves well to economic analogies. So that segues to my question, which is how best to teach economics, and specifically, I would like it if you would share recommendations on how we might learn more about economics in addition to reading your writings. Schools of economics that may be doing a good job, or any other, I would be surprised actually if it's schools, but any good sources of economic learning that you're aware of, if you would share those, I would appreciate it. Thank you again.
All right, well, thanks for your comments and your observations. You may be right. I may just be too square, or too much of a nerd or whatever to have a lot of success, reaching people with economics and bars. You may be right that there's an opportunity there. And obviously, wherever you see the opportunity, take it. So I've put out quite a large body of material. I focus on monetary economics. And I argue that it should really be called monetary science. In that area, first of all, everybody here should be aware that my views are not necessarily accepted. Forget by the mainstream, of course. The mainstream all exists to justify the incipient fascist, dictatorship that's coming. But even within the Austrian School of Economics, my views are not necessarily accepted, and many of them may be very controversial. So, of the 3 or 4 major, schools of economics, I think the Keynesians are basically utterly without any redeeming merit whatsoever. The Chicago School, the Milton Friedman School, outside of the monetary area, Milton Friedman, made a case for freedom, and morally aside, he was against the idea of making a moral argument. He was very utilitarian, but he had some pretty good ideas in there. Largely, I would say I'm a follower and a student of the Austrian School of Economics, which is infinitely better than the other 2 schools. And so I could certainly recommend reading the writings of Carl Menger, back in the late 19th century. He's the founder of the Austrian School, and I think the purist in a lot of ways, and introduced a number of ideas, which I referred to very briefly earlier, is in thinking about the mechanics of price formation, and what's the bid and what's the ask, and the fact that there are always 2 prices in a market and not one. And I think that gives you a grounding that all this, sort of macro talk can either take for granted or can completely omit, depending on, sort of how you study it. That said, in his successors, I think I don't necessarily agree with Mises and the other more modern Austrians, particularly in the areas of money and credit. Mises himself, you know, with caveats and other cautionary words around it, accepted the linear quantity theory of money, for example. And so the Austrians have a pretty well-developed theory of the business cycle. And, in that, the central bank, stimulates malinvestment, and then eventually the malinvestment has to be liquidated. I think that's pretty good, but I would go farther. I refine it and go farther than that. And so I'm sort of reserving my recommendation for their works in money and credit, based on my particular views. So what I can certainly say is, go out there and read my stuff. I have everything from short articles that I did on Forbes or now snbchf.com to much longer papers. My article on the collapse of the Swiss franc was, I think, 6,500 words. And I'm presenting a different kind of an approach. Ultimately, I need to write probably a book talking about this approach to monetary science and how you think about this. Obviously, in this lecture, I didn't really, I used it implicitly, but I didn't really describe it. So I'm not sure I can really fully answer your question, and for that, I apologize. I guess in general, read if you have the inclination and the time, and be critical and always be asking yourself, okay, now what's the mechanism of this? Right? Mises is saying, a loan is as a trade of a present good for a future good. Right? And if you've studied objectivism and concept formation and so forth, ask yourself, what is a future good? What does that mean? Is that reification of the zero? Is there such a thing in existence as a future good? Or is there perhaps a problem with that concept? What does it really mean? Unfortunately, I guess thinking at that level is hard. I think, and to answer another part of your question, the clearer that you can articulate something, the more likely you are to be able to reach people with it. And I regard that as a big part of my job, is to study this stuff and say, okay, how do I reduce this? Not oversimplify it, not dumb it down, but how do I reduce it to its essentials in such a way that people can relate to it and say, okay, yeah, that clicks, yeah, that makes sense. Or the question I had earlier, I think it was from Alfred, but forgive me if I'm mistaken on that, who said, I can see some of what you're saying, but it's very abstract. How do you continue to refine your ability to articulate it so that it doesn't seem so abstract, so that it gets clearer and clearer? That's ultimately what we need in order to create an economic revolution.
Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. I'm wondering if there's some way to quantify this idea that we're using up our seed corn. Could you roughly equate that to capital assets or possibly to book value of the stock market? And is that going up or down? And does that mean anything?
That's a really interesting question. I don't really think of it, and I suppose you could do a study there. I haven't really thought about it in terms of, book value or a ratio of market cap to book value or anything like that. One way that I think about it, and I've written a couple of articles recently on a term that I coined called yield to purchasing power. So the conventional view is to try to figure out, how much you can afford. People think of it in terms of, okay, I've reached 65, I have $1 million, groceries cost me whatever, $50,000 a year, so I could live 20 years. It's basically, if I liquidate my savings, I liquidate my assets, how much groceries can I buy if I sell the farm? And I think that view is totally erroneous and a historical anomaly. Throughout most times in history, people wouldn't have thought that way. And so I propose thinking about it as how much yield can you get for $1 worth of capital, which is the yield purchasing power. Well, then yield purchasing power is how much groceries can you buy on the yield on your farm, rather than selling the tractor and ultimately selling the land and the barns to buy groceries. How many groceries can you produce on the farm? Or if you're selling the produce from the farm, how many groceries equivalent does that buy? And so that, of course, is again a function of the interest rate. The more the interest rate goes down, the more the yield on capital assets is going down. It's all related because of those arbitrages I described earlier. So in a certain sense, you could say when that hits zero, we're done, right? If there is no such thing as a yield on your capital anymore, then the value of the capital in dollar terms may be irrelevant, but that means there's no profit from operating the capital anymore. And so then everything is going to go, into the final melt in the furnace. It's going to be like Mao's agricultural revolution, or whatever they called it, when he said we need to produce more steel. So they gathered up and melted all the farm implements to produce ingots of steel. That's the final thing, right? And the next thing is 30 million peasants die, the next year. I don't know if I fully answered your question, but it's. I could talk. Maybe that'll be a topic of another lecture. What are the indicators, and how would you quantify, the end game of the failure of the system?
All right, so I think we're going on like an hour and 15 minutes, and I don't think we have any more questions here. So if you have something you want to say to wrap it up, I'll let you do that, and then we'll call it a day. But thanks.
All right, well, thanks everybody for listening. I hope I provoked a few thoughts, and hopefully we'll have a chance to do this again.